The rule was something passed down through the digital ether, a piece of modern folklore whispered in internet forums and late-night schoolyard dares. Don't blink in the mirror at 3:14 a.m. To anyone with a shred of logic, it was nothing more than a cheap creepypasta designed to frighten gullible kids. Leo had always prided himself on being a skeptic, someone who demanded empirical evidence before believing in the supernatural. Yet, tonight, logic felt thin and fragile. Insomnia had settled into his bones like a deep, unshakable ache, leaving his mind wired and restless while the rest of the world slept. The silence in his suburban house was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, watching the shadows stretch and distort as cars occasionally passed by outside. The only sound was the rhythmic, metallic ticking of the clock on his nightstand. He rolled over, his eyes instinctively catching the glowing red digits of the display. It read 3:12 a.m. A sudden, irrational spike of nervous adrenaline hit his chest. The rumor flashed across his mind again, vivid and mocking. Why 3:14? Some threads claimed it was a corruption of pi, an infinite loop in the fabric of reality, while others whispered it was the exact moment a nameless tragedy had occurred in the town decades ago. The clock clicked to 3:13 a.m. Leo felt a bizarre challenge rise within him. It was the exhaustion talking, he knew, but the urge to prove the internet wrong became overwhelming. Standing up, the floorboards felt unusually cold beneath his bare feet. He walked down the dark hallway, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He pushed open the bathroom door, the hinges emitting a low, mournful groan. He stood before the sink, took a deep breath, and waited. The red light from the hallway clock cast a faint glow. Then, the time changed. It was exactly 3:14 a.m. Leo locked his eyes onto his own reflection and refused to close his lids. The first 10 seconds were easy. His reflection stared back at him, familiar and exhausted. Leo could see the dark circles under his eyes, the messy tangle of his hair, and the slight tension in his jaw. It was just a mirror, a simple sheet of silvered glass reflecting the dim, ambient light of the room. But as the seconds ticked away into the silence, the atmosphere in the small bathroom began to shift. The air pressure seemed to drop, causing a faint, high-pitched ringing to echo in his ears. By 20 seconds, the temperature plummeted with impossible speed. Leo watched in disbelief as his breath suddenly materialized into a thick, white plume of mist, curling in the air between himself and the glass. The cold didn't just chill his skin, it felt heavy, creeping into his lungs with every shallow breath he took. His eyes were beginning to burn now, the intense strain of holding them wide open causing them to water. A single, hot tear welled up in the corner of his left eye, but he forced himself to stay perfectly still. He wouldn't back down from a silly internet myth. At exactly 30 seconds in, a paralyzing dread locked his muscles in place. It wasn't just the cold, it was a primal, instinctual alarm ringing inside his brain, screaming at him to run. He wanted to turn away, to look at the door, to do anything but stare at the glass, but his body refused to cooperate. He was trapped in his own skin, anchored by the gaze of the figure before him. That was when he noticed the most terrifying detail of all. Leo's chest was heaving with panicked, rapid breaths, his shoulders moving up and down. But the version of him in the mirror stood perfectly, unnaturally, and horrifyingly still. The realization hit Leo like a physical blow. The reflection wasn't breathing. While the white mist of Leo's own breath fogged the air on his side, the glass remained completely clear on the other. The boy in the mirror was a statue, an imitation of life that had suddenly decided to stop pretending. Leo's mind raced, searching for any logical explanation, an optical illusion, a trick of the dim light, a hallucination brought on by sleep deprivation, but deep down, he knew the truth. The rules of reality had bent, and he was caught in the fracture. The urge to blink was becoming an agonizing torture. His eyes felt as dry as sandpaper, the muscles twitching violently as they demanded relief. Another tear slipped down his cheek, tracing a wet path through the cold sweat on his face. He tried to force his eyelids wider, desperate to maintain the gaze, terrified of what might happen if he broke the connection. The silence in the room seemed to stretch, expanding until it felt like a physical weight pressing against his eardrums. Then, the reflection moved independently. Slowly, deliberately, the lips of the figure in the glass began to move. The corners of its mouth curled upward, stretching far wider than Leo's face ever could. It was an unnatural, jagged smile that reached all the way to its empty, unblinking eyes. The sight was deeply wrong, a mockery of human expression that sent a shiver of pure terror down Leo's spine. The reflection raised its right hand, lifting it toward the surface of the mirror. It moved with a smooth, terrifying grace, completely unbothered by the frozen air that gripped the room. Leo could only watch, paralyzed, as the nightmare unfolded. The reflection's palm pressed flat against the inside of the glass. To Leo's horror, a dull, heavy thud echoed through the bathroom, as if the entity had struck a solid wall from the other side. Where the reflection's fingers touched the surface, a thick patch of condensation bloomed, leaving a perfect, ghostly handprint on the glass. The creature was testing the boundaries, finding the barrier that separated its world from Leo's. Leo's vision was beginning to blur around the edges. Dark spots danced in his periphery, and the burning in his eyes had turned into a searing pain. His eyelids trembled violently, completely beyond his control. He knew he was reaching his absolute limit. The entity in the mirror seemed to know it too. Its smile widened even further, revealing glinting teeth, and it leaned closer to the glass, its eyes widening in anticipation. It was waiting for the inevitable moment of weakness. "Don't do it," Leo tried to scream, but the words caught in his throat, reduced to a breathless, silent gasp. His body was failing him. The sheer exhaustion of the night, combined with the suffocating terror, crushed his resolve. He held on for one more agonizing heartbeat, watching the monstrous imitation of himself stare back with hungry intensity. But human biology could only be fought for so long. His defenses crumbled, the muscles relaxed, and his eyelids snapped shut. It lasted for only a fraction of a second, a single, fleeting moment of darkness. But it was exactly what the entity had been waiting for. When Leo's eyes snapped open, the burning pain was gone, replaced by a profound, disorienting confusion. The bathroom was plunged into pitch-black darkness. The faint red glow from the hallway clock was entirely gone, and the silver moonlight that had filtered through the window had vanished, leaving nothing but an oppressive, heavy void. He gasped for air, but the atmosphere felt thin, dry, and devoid of life. Panic setting in, Leo reached out blindly to steady himself against the familiar porcelain sink. But his hands didn't meet the cool, rounded edge of the counter. Instead, his fingers struck a smooth, flat, freezing sheet of material. He pressed his palms forward, feeling around in the dark. It was everywhere in front of him, an unyielding, solid wall of glass. He pushed against it with all his might, but it didn't budge even a fraction of an inch. Suddenly, a light flickered on from the other side of the barrier. The sudden brightness blinded him for a second, causing him to shield his eyes. As his vision cleared, he looked through the clear pane and froze in utter disbelief. He wasn't looking into a mirror anymore. He was looking out of one. He was standing inside the mirror frame, staring into the real bathroom. And there, standing on the outside, right where Leo had been just moments ago, was his own body. The entity had crossed over, leaving Leo trapped inside the cold, narrow confines of the glass cage. Leo began to beat his fists against the glass, screaming at the top of his lungs, but no sound escaped into the room. The barrier swallowed his voice entirely, leaving him in a silent, suffocating vacuum. On the other side, his body stood perfectly still, adjusting to its new flesh. Leo watched in horror as the imposter lifted its hands, examining the fingers with a look of detached curiosity. It stretched its arms, twisted its neck until it popped, and took a deep, audible breath of the real world's air. The creature turned its head slowly, looking directly at the mirror. For a terrifying second, their eyes met. The imposter didn't smile with the monstrous grin from before, instead, it wore a cold, empty expression of triumph. It reached down to the counter and picked up Leo's phone, the screen illuminating its face in a pale blue light. It checked the time, 3:15 a.m. The minute of the curse had passed, and the trap was firmly shut. Without a single glance backward, the entity turned its back to the mirror. It walked out of the bathroom, stepping into the dark hallway, its footsteps fading into the distance as it headed toward Leo's bedroom. The bathroom light switched off automatically, plunging Leo back into the absolute, freezing darkness of the glass. He was entirely alone, trapped in a world of silence, while something else lived his life, wore his clothes, and slept in his bed. He had broken the rule, and now, he had all of eternity to regret the single blink that cost him everything.